This is Up Close. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. On this week's episode, we're looking at new kinds of warfare, including the consequences for non-combatants. Many people talk about the idea that cyber warfare is coming and that we'll someday be seeing large-scale attacks that have ramifications in the real world. But senior correspondent at the Daily Beast, Shane Harris, reports that cyber war is here and has been for some time. We discuss the reality and the consequences in his book, At War, The Rise of the Military Internet Complex. To know more about war and what our businesses and governments are doing, we need reporting on those things, but journalists are increasingly facing great dangers in their profession. Executive Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, Joel Simon, is the author of The New Censorship: Inside the Global Battle for Media Freedom. But first, here's my interview with Shane Harris. I think in the popular imagination, certainly in the popular reporting, there's all this hand-wringing and so forth that cyber warfare is coming. Cyber warfare could come in this way, could come in that way, but in fact, it's here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that you can go back even to the mid-1990s and find people who were working in the intelligence community in the U.S. who were talking about the day would come when we would be reliant on computer networks to the point that they would make vulnerabilities for us. So, you know, our electrical power grid and our utilities and all of these things that are run off the internet. But also that would be a great place for our intelligence agencies to exploit and to steal information from other countries and to do damage to them. And really, you see this kind of taking off even in the early 2000s and mid-2000s, particularly in the war in Iraq, where we deployed a lot of offensive cyber espionage and cyber attacks. So it's coming into the fore now in the public consciousness, and policymakers are talking about it, but it really has been something that the military and the intelligence community have been practicing for quite a while.
Well, let's talk about the Stuxnet virus with Iran for a little bit, because that was a project that was first widely credited to Israeli intelligence, but then President Obama took specific credit for the United States on some of that once it really hit. And then in your reporting, you show it going back well into the Bush administration.
Yeah, this is a program that really begins under Bush, who we should also add to, in the latter part of his term in office, really did come to embrace both the idea that America was vulnerable to cyber attack, but also that the United States had significant capabilities to do cyber attacks against other countries. And Stuxnet was one of these examples. And so what we now know is that the NSA, working with Israel, developed this computer code, essentially, that told the computers in the uranium enrichment plant at Natanz to spin the centrifuges in such a way that they would break down. Bush, I think, really embraced this as one of the key methods or techniques they had for trying to forestall Iran's development of a nuclear weapon. And when President Obama was coming into office, the two of them met when President Obama was president-elect, and Bush told him there are a couple of programs that you need to maintain, one of which was the use of drones, and the other was this program known as Olympic Games at the time. And I think that Bush really saw this as sort of at the forefront of the leading edge of our capabilities in a way of, short of actually bombing the Iranians, of trying to forestall their development of a weapon. And in a way, I think they sort of viewed it as a way of trying to keep the peace, even though you could look at it as an act of war. I mean, if we had gone and bombed that facility, that would have been seen as clearly an aggressive action. Putting a computer code in it that causes damage to the centrifuges as well, that kind of gets close to that category too.
And now, the dangers journalists face with Joel Simon. If you looked at the world of communication 4 years ago, when we had Facebook taking over and Twitter taking over, and we had this Arab Spring that seemed in large part to be based on social media, you had a lot of people, a lot of triumphalists saying, wow, we live in a new world of communication, we live in a new world of information, and you just can't stop information. But that's not true.
That's not true at all.
Yeah.
In fact, that's the central paradigm that I explore in the book. This is supposed to be the new information age, but if you look at the statistics, more journalists are being killed, more journalists are being imprisoned, press freedom is in decline, and the reality is that the deluge of information, the quantity of information that we're exposed to, blinds us to the tremendous gaps in the knowledge that we have about global affairs, and this is the central paradox that I explore in the book.
And it's not just about saying, oh, well, journalists can't do certain things. It's the information, there's information that only journalists can get. And other people are being blocked in ways that haven't been fully explored?
Well, I think one of the other broad framework for the discussion is that there's a debate within journalism and the media community about which was better, the old system in which we had established bureaus and experienced correspondents and journalists were the information gatekeepers, or the new system in which anybody with a cell phone could be a journalist and they're out there documenting information and sharing it. And I argue it doesn't matter. What exists, exists. This is the world in which we live in, and these two mutual systems must function in coordination in order for us to receive the information we need. Often the frontline documentation now, say of a protest rally, or as you discussed, what was happening in Tahrir Square, that is done by people who happen to be witnesses but have the ability to document it. But the context, the ability to disseminate this information to mass audiences, we still depend on journalists for that. And both systems are under tremendous pressure, and that's the central reality.
And then that kind of puts it on a spectrum of relative control of journalists, where here in America we have a lot of criticism of corporate control of media, and then obviously on the international front we're talking about state control of media, and then leading all the way to the citizen journalist, who is theoretically controlled by no one other than their own interests. How are we weighing all these different dynamics against each other?
Well, do we want a freedom of expression framework in terms of the global information ecosystem? Let's recognize that, why do we have a First Amendment in the United States? Why do we tolerate speech that is abhorrent? Why do we protect it and defend it? Because we believe that if you give the government authority to restrict speech, they will abuse that authority, and that people are mature enough to access to different kinds of speech and make their own judgments and tolerate disruptive speech. Well, let's recognize that same argument should function in a global context, particularly at a moment when the flow of information globally is essential to our well-being. So the question is, do we want a First Amendment context domestically and a repressive, controlled context internationally where national security frameworks prevail, or do we want a freedom of expression framework globally in which we have to tolerate some of these upsetting, disruptive, abhorrent voices, but give citizens around the world the ability to judge this information, make their own decisions, and compete with this information? I would argue, and the book argues, that the latter is the better framework.
That's all for this week's abbreviated web episode of Up Close. A reminder, you can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish Channel on cable, or listen to the full audio of the show as a podcast, available on iTunes and your favorite podcast player. The Jewish Channel is available on cable: Time Warner Cable Channel 1640, IOFLM Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Cox Cable Channel 1, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, and on Comcast on the on-demand menu on premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.